So there's now Minister of Electricity Kgosientsho Ramokgopa says he wants South Africa to ramp up grid expansion. He said in the next 2 weeks he will outline the plan for the work they have done. But the question is how they will access the funds for the 14,000-kilometer transmission lines. Ramokgopa yesterday briefing the media on the state of energy in the country. Let's discuss this further now. We're joined by Mohamed Madhi, energy specialist and CEO of Sinan Energy. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Last year there were plans, as we heard, to start working on the grid expansion, and we heard about 47 grid expansion projects that were planned for the country with the potential to add about 37,000 megawatts to the grid. So given the recent developments and where things are right now, does it look like we're on track?
Look, I think the big question is the funding. And we don't yet have a clear understanding of the funding. It's really important for us as a country to get a good sense of what the funding entails, what strings are attached to the funding, and what exactly is that funding going to unlock. So at this point, there isn't enough detail, so it's very difficult to say we're on track. And looking at the reality on the ground, looking at the current state of the grid and the current state of projects underway, we're certainly very far from being on track.
Do you then, listening to what you're saying, then do you then believe the minister when he says that financing of the grid expansion is not a problem? The only thing that is a key question is how to get access to the funding.
Look, grid access or the transmission line funding itself has always been a problem in almost every other developing country around the world. One of the reasons is that we as a country, and generally countries, don't want to give up ownership of their transmission line. So there are various models, financial models, to still allow the funding. What we need to understand are what are the strings that are attached to that funding, what are the constraints, and how does it lock us in terms of our long-term strategy? Because the state of the grid, the state of the transmission infrastructure is fundamental to our long-term strategy. And we need to understand if there is any funding going to be available, how does it lock us in, and how does it constrain us?
And of course, the minister saying that he's going to be providing these plans in about 2 weeks' time. And I suppose then transparency is going to be key, as you are saying then that we need to know in terms of the future what we're getting ourselves into.
Absolutely, because look, the energy strategy is at risk if we don't do this properly. And also, hopefully the minister unveils some of these plans and allows comment by relevant bodies, stakeholders, experts, etc. And hopefully it's not a fait accompli by the time these plans are unveiled, because it could have disastrous consequences for the long-term strategy of this country.
Yeah, and what would those disastrous consequences be then, if I may, if you may indulge just further on that?
Let's take an example where you have a toll system, just to use a simple analogy that everyone can relate to. So you have toll roads, and those toll roads are operated by toll road operators, and they charge a certain fee. Similarly, on the transmission network, you could have a fee being charged by the network operators who fund the expansion of the grid. And for them to get a return, they would charge a fee on every kilowatt that is sent across that grid. Now, if that fee is unduly high, what it means is that the overall base cost of electricity is then going to be uncompetitive in as far as the transmission cost is, is concerned. And that's what we need to be very careful of. What impact does this have ultimately on the cost per kilowatt hour to ordinary citizens, to businesses, and to institutions?
So then, when you look at this, then this particular industry, do we then have a bit of a monopoly then for us to run the risk of what you've just described, or do we have various players that could then also make things a bit more competitive?
You see, what we want from the infrastructure, from the transmission infrastructure, is an independent operator. So it was always, mooted that we would have a system operator, and Eskom is actually very well placed. The one thing Eskom is well placed to do is to be that system operator, and for those tariffs to then be regulated like they currently are by NERSA, and the funding not to impact on that process. Because we have fantastic renewable energy resources around the country, and as you rightly pointed out, there are many, many megawatts that can be unlocked. We don't want those megawatts to be constrained for financial reasons. They are currently constrained for grid access reasons. Just as bad would be to constrain them for financial reasons.
And finally, then, very briefly, I mean, someone is, watching tonight and they say, but if you talk about the grid expansion and we're looking at the fact that right now we're still being hit by load shedding, albeit in different stages as a country, how much of pressure could this then alleviate from the grid?
I think it could alleviate a substantial amount of pressure, however, not in the short term. Grid expansion typically takes several years, and especially when it's done properly, and it has to be done properly in this case. So unfortunately, it's not going to be a solution that's going to bring any relief in the next couple of years.
All right, so thank you so much, Mr. Madhi, for your time. Do appreciate it. That was Mohamed Madhi, Energy Specialist and CEO of Sinan Energy Solution.